So I wanted to go over with you real quick some topics for the final exam that I think you guys should review for the final. From Chapter 6, first and foremost, understand how opportunity cost relates to the market supply curve and why the supply curve is upward sloping. Know how to calculate marginal cost, and it's a little different than we calculated marginal cost previously. Remember, this is the change in total cost divided by the change in output. So previously, the change in output was always just 1, so the marginal cost was just the change in total cost. But in this chapter, remember that we have to divide by the change in output. So if I hire one more worker and output changes by 20, the marginal cost is going to be the cost of that worker divided by 20. Also have to understand profit maximization for a perfectly competitive firm. Remember, the rule for competition is price equals marginal revenue, and so price equals marginal cost is the profit maximizing rule. Looking at the graphs and the charts and understanding where the profit maximization occurs is critically important. And also know how to calculate the firm's shutdown condition in the long and short run, but Chapter 6 is primarily the short run. So remember, where price is less than average variable cost, the firm will shut down. If the price is greater than average variable cost, the firm will stay in business even if they're making a loss. Know how to calculate producer surplus, and also understand how to calculate a firm's profit just by looking at the graph. So remember, profit is price minus average total cost, times the quantity. So quantity times price minus average total cost is profit. And so it's that little rectangle, if you remember, on the graph. And feel free to look at the videos from Chapter 6 from AC/DC Econ. There's some really good comprehensive reviews on how to calculate marginal cost and kind of how to calculate profit for a firm in the Chapter 6 module. For Chapter 7, the main thing is accounting versus economic profit, and specifically the invisible hand theory. And so how economic profit is typically zero in the long run, and whenever firms are earning positive economic profit, other people from other industries are going to want to enter, which is going to shift the supply curve to the right, drive the price down until economic profit is zero in all different industries. So also understand the difference between economic profit and economic rent. That was sort of important. And the difference between an equilibrium and a social optimum. So this doesn't make too much difference once we're talking about goods without externalities and goods with perfect competition. Usually equilibrium is the social optimum. But once we got into Chapter 8 and Chapter 10 and Chapter 14, the difference was there was a difference. So equilibrium was not necessarily the social optimum, as we'll see in the further chapters. With Chapter 7 also, you have to understand how to calculate total surplus and calculate the deadweight loss or the loss in economic surplus when the market isn't allowed to reach equilibrium. So consumer surplus plus producer surplus equals total surplus. And so understand how to calculate total surplus in equilibrium and what the total surplus is when we're not in equilibrium, for instance, if the government was to have a price control. For Chapter 8, now we're going to talk about imperfect competition. So know the difference between the 3 different types of imperfect competition, very much like your discussion questions. Know how to calculate the marginal revenue for a monopolist. So remember, marginal revenue is different for a monopolist than it is for a competitive firm because monopolists face the downward sloping demand curve. So if they increase output, they're going to have to decrease the price they charge for everything else. So therefore, marginal revenue is always less than price for a monopolist. Know how to find the monopolist profit maximizing level of output and the price they'll charge in equilibrium. So remember, the monopolist maximizes profit where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So they restrict output and then they charge the highest price consumers will pay. So that's the price where the demand curve is at that profit maximizing quantity. Again, there's plenty of videos on the modules to kind of highlight how these firms work and how to figure out the monopolist profit maximizing price and quantity. Also understand how to calculate the deadweight loss created under a monopoly. So remember, we're talking about market failures now, and so understanding how to calculate total surplus under a competitive firm and total surplus under a monopoly is going to be also, again, critically important. And so remember, deadweight loss is that little triangle, and the calculation or the formula for calculating the area of a triangle is 1/2 base times height. Then we moved into Chapter 9, which is game theory. So you need to understand the three elements of a game. So if you have players, strategies, and payoffs, you have a game. Understand what a cartel is and why they're unstable, primarily a prisoner's dilemma problem. You need to know how to solve a payoff matrix or a one-shot game for a Nash equilibrium. And again, back to the prisoner's dilemma, you need to understand the definition of a prisoner's dilemma, which is a game where both players have a dominant strategy, and when both players play that dominant strategy, the resulting payoffs are smaller than if they had played their dominated strategy. And you also need to know how to find a game or find the equilibrium in a game where timing matters. So that's the games with the game tree, and you have to use backward induction to solve for those equilibria. Then we're in chapter 10. So for chapter 10 was all about externalities. And so understanding the difference between negative and positive externalities is critical. And so for negative externalities, remember there's an extra cost associated with the action. And with positive externalities, there's an extra benefit associated with the action. Be able to identify the socially optimal outcome between two or three situations. And so I guess that's talking about the Coase theorem. And so if we're talking about, I guess, operate with a filter, without a filter, or with two filters, understand which one is socially optimal. And so typically there we're talking about the one with the highest payout or the highest total amount of money that can be earned among how many different parties there are. So remember, economists care mainly about the size of the pie, not so much who gets it. And so when we're talking about socially optimal things in the Coase theorem setting, we're really talking about who gets the most money or which outcome gives the most money total. And so again, we have to understand the Coase theorem. Describe how government can alleviate the externality problems using taxes and subsidies. So what is the externality problem? Well, when we have negative externalities, the firms are going to equate private costs and private benefits instead of social costs and private benefits. And so that results in the firms producing too much of the good, which produces a negative externality. So for instance, pollution. And if government charges a tax exactly the same size as the externality, then they can basically push the firm's private cost curve exactly equal to the social cost curve and completely resolve the problem. And the opposite end is what's called a subsidy. And so if we have a positive externality, like a flu shot, I'm only going to equate my private benefit with my private cost, not the social benefit. So as a result, when we have positive externalities, the market produces too little of the good. And so to fix that, the government could pay me $20 every time I want to go get a flu shot. And then I know that I'm not only going to get a flu shot, but a $20 bill. And that could increase my private benefit up closer to the social benefit and make me get more flu shots in equilibrium. Understand also how property rights impact equilibrium outcomes, and that's kind of the tragedy of the commons outcome. And so remember that assigning property rights is really how most of the laws and regulations that address externalities work. And so who has the right to quiet? Well, between 11 at night and 8 in the morning, I have the right to quiet, but between 8 in the morning and 11 at night, people who want to listen to music have the right to listen to music. And so it's all about assigning property rights to really fix externality problems. Last, we have chapter 11, which you didn't really have a homework on, but the big concepts in this one are public versus private goods. And remember table 14.1, which shows the difference between whether a good is non-rival in consumption and also if it's non-excludable, and where they land on that scale, whether or not it's a public good, a private good, a commons good, or a collective good. And so make sure you understand the difference between those goods, which was part of your discussion question. Also understand about paying for public goods, so the different types of taxes and how they work and how they can kind of not work as well, because people have incentives to not say their true valuation sometimes. Think about the optimal quantity of a public good. How do we get the demand curve for a public good, which you can see in figure 14.2. How could the private market get provision of a public good? Does that work? Does it not work? So you want to study up about that. And also then think about kind of government intervention, laws, regulations, and the question of centralized control over public goods and how that works out in the market as well. So the real thing I want you to focus on for chapter 11 is examples 14.1 through 14.3, the ones about taxation, and also table 14.1 about public versus private, common versus collective goods. Okay, I hope this helps you guys study, and I hope you guys do a great job on the final.